Again, we'd like to turn to Genesis 50. And again, we'll read verses 18 through 20. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, Fear not, for I am in the place of God. For it is for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Again, the fact of Joseph's birth is recorded in Genesis 30, verses 22 through 24. The next time we see him is Genesis 37, verse 2, and he's 17 years old. And the remainder of the book of Genesis is a record of Joseph's life. Again, a very remarkable, a very instructive life. His life is a declaration that a child of God can thrive and do what is right regardless of what happens. Joseph serves as a rebuke to all who use their circumstances as an excuse not to serve the Lord, to use their past experiences, whatever it might be, as an excuse not to serve the Lord. Again, Joseph is an illustration of an individual who rose above challenging circumstances, some horrible experiences. His life involved a painful path, but nowhere do you see in the record of his life Joseph viewing himself as a victim of his parents, of his family, of his environment, or of his circumstances. He rose above it all. The life of Joseph shows us that even in extremely adverse circumstances, there is a proper way to respond. As we all know, life is not always going to be comfortable. It's going to involve some suffering, some difficulty, some injustice, and some pain. But the life of Joseph teaches us that one can be an influence of good regardless, and can be a blessing to others in spite of the sufferings of life. So in Joseph, we see a person committed to God, what a person committed to God can be and can do. So I want to speak of the child of God and the happenings of life. His life serves as a model. It's a story of hope. It's a story of encouragement. And in him we see a demonstration of overcoming faith, a life of victory. We must not view his life as fictional, but we must view his life as historical, and again, as a real life story, an example to us. I want to consider again the circumstances of Joseph, but this time we want to see it Joseph doing the right thing regardless of his circumstances. Joseph had a very dysfunctional family. He was born into a family that was embroiled in controversy and dissension. He was born into a family marked by immorality, by turmoil, by vice, jealousy, bitterness, and violence. And Joseph was born into that family. Jacob, his father, was a liar. He was a manipulator. He was a conniver. He was a self-centered schemer. Jacob, his father, at a very young age, had two wives, Leah and Rachel. And these were sisters, and they were his cousins, Jacob's cousins. These were his wives. Leah, of course, became pregnant, not once, but 4 times. Gave birth to Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, one after the other. Rachel, still without child, she takes matters into her own hands and gives Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, to have children in her place. And she has 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Leah sees this, so she gives her handmaid Zilpah to have children. And she has 2 sons, Gad and Asher. After a time, Leah has 3 more children by Jacob, Issachar, Zebulun, and a daughter, Dinah. So now Jacob, Joseph's father, has 10 sons and 1 daughter. But Rachel is still barren. But to her would be born Joseph and Benjamin. This is the family that Joseph is born into. So Joseph's mother is his second cousin. He has 3 stepmothers and 10 half-brothers, 1 half-sister, and 1 brother, being Benjamin. Joseph's grandfather, Laban, which would have been from his mother's side, he had chased down the family, accused Jacob of stealing, and they agreed to never see each other. So Joseph never would have seen his grandfather. Joseph's sister, half-sister, Dinah, is raped by Shechem, and his brothers kill the men of the city. Reuben, the oldest brother, he commits incest with his father's concubine, Bilhah. So this is a very dysfunctional, even by today's standards, this is a dysfunctional family. Joseph spent his formative years in a home marked by sin, sadness, strife, and one struggle after another. Joseph's formative years were in an environment of immorality, rape, murder, incest, betrayal, jealousy, turmoil, anger, hatred, and death. Joseph had a tragic family background. The dysfunction was deeply rooted. You would think he doesn't have a chance. He doesn't have a chance. There have been many times where I've been in the birthing room and felt so sorry for a baby that was born into a certain family. And all you could do is pray, Lord, help them. And Joseph would come to mind. But in spite of this dysfunction, Joseph would rise above the dysfunction. And the reason? The Lord was with Joseph. That's the reason. So looking at Joseph's family, most would have concluded he doesn't stand a chance. But the Lord was with Joseph. He rose above it all. I don't believe, I feel sorry for some people that are born into the families they're born into. I really do. I feel bad for them. But it's no excuse. It's no excuse. Never is. We have sympathy for them. But it's not an excuse. Don't get stuck there. Joseph's life was made up of extreme changes. So you have this dysfunctional family. And then his life was just one extreme change after another. Genesis 37, verse 4 and verse 8, he's hated by his brothers. They're filled with resentment toward him. They have bitterness toward him, animosity and ill will toward him, so much so that they could not speak peaceably with him. They would speak of him, and they would speak to him, but it would have been in a tone of mockery and ridicule and slander. And we read in verse 8 of Genesis 37, they hated him yet the more. That is, their feelings of hatred toward him was in an intensifying manner. And I'm sure that Jacob was wounded by their words many times. I'm sure that Joseph's feelings were hurt many times by their words. He was wronged every day by his brothers. It was offense upon offense. We read in verse 11 that his brethren envied him. That needs to be understood in the light of Proverbs 27:4. Wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? So Joseph hated and envied by his brothers, and he would have dealt with this on a daily basis. He's offended over and over and over. But he rose above it. He rose above it. Never used it as an excuse. And yet today, I've seen it so many times, you have too. People get offended by the slightest things and use it as an excuse not to go to church. They need to read the life of Joseph. Here is a man that was mistreated over and over. 17 years. Over and over. Joseph is betrayed, rejected, conspired against by his own brothers. They strip him of his coat. They cast him into a cistern where there is no water. He has been mistreated. He has been done an injustice by his brothers. We learned from their later testimony. Notice in Genesis 42, verse 21. that they saw, after they cast him into the pit, they saw the anguish of his soul, and he pleaded with them, and they ignored him. Genesis 42, verse 21. And they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore is this distress come upon us. So there is Joseph in this cistern, pleading with his brothers, don't do this, don't do this. And they just ignored him. They just ignored him. All the wrong that was done to Joseph. Not just once, but over and over. And yet we hear him say here in Genesis 50 verse 20, ye thought evil against me. But God meant it unto good. Those who are so easily offended, they need to look at their offenses through the lens of but God. I can get through this because of Him. Yes, an injustice has been done. Unfairness. But I can get past this. And I have to get past this if I'm going to serve God. Can't use it as an excuse. I'll tell you right now, you try using that as an excuse when you stand before the Lord in judgment. So, after reading Genesis 50 verse 20, Joseph did not go to his grave bitter over what his brothers had done. And Joseph didn't just imagine it. A lot of people go to their graves bitter over imagined offenses. These weren't imagined. These were real offenses. But what shaped his life? Again, Genesis 50:20, ye thought evil against me. That's not what shaped his life. What shaped his life was, but God. But God. We have to be careful what we allow to shape our life, because it's very easy. You thought evil against me, and have that shape your thinking, your whole life, and then you pass that on to your family, and on it goes for generation after generation after generation. Joseph is sold into slavery. Has a direct result, humanly speaking, we know God's hand's in it, but he's sold into slavery, has a direct result of his brother's mistreatment of him. So as Joseph is sold into slavery, he could have sat in Potiphar's house and thought, if my brothers had not done this, I would not be here in this situation. In a sense, that's very true. But that's not how Joseph thought. So he's brought down to Egypt, sold to a man named Potiphar. He has gone from enjoying the privileges of his father's home to what would amount to a 22-year separation from his father. But instead of griping and complaining and fussing and being bitter about the situation, what did he do? He served where he was. He served where he was. So much so that his master saw the Lord is with him. His master could see the Lord was with Joseph. So, in spite of a dysfunctional family, in spite of being hated by his brothers, betrayed, rejected, and conspired against by his brothers, and as a result of all that, he is now a slave. But he lives in such a way that others could see the Lord's with him. The Lord's with him. He didn't use any of it as an excuse. I have been very, very blunt with people who use life events as an excuse, and I always get the same reply. You just don't understand. Oh, I know the story of Joseph, and what you're telling me is nowhere near as bad as him, and he did the right thing. You can too. You can too. Then Joseph, of course, is falsely accused. During his time in Potiphar's house, he, because of his testimony, became more than a mere slave. He runs the household pretty much. But Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39:7, cast her eye upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Joseph, well, because of my dysfunctional family and all the terrible things that happened, that this is why I did it. No, that would be a lie. Joseph did what was right. He did what was right. He stayed focused upon living his life for God and staying pure. He didn't use his family as an excuse. Didn't use any of those things. But she would continue in her seductive ways, but he stood steadfast, fending off her advances. And this would continue for some time. And she became more determined. She became more forceful in her attempts to seduce Joseph. And in verse 12 it says he fled and got himself out. But she brought false accusation against Joseph. And again, Joseph is wronged. An injustice has occurred in Joseph's life. Joseph didn't throw up his hands, didn't take the attitude, I'm a victim. But his attitude is he's going to serve God. He's going to serve God. Because of the false accusation, again, you can trace it all back to his brother's hatred. You could trace his brother's hatred to Jacob being unfair. Joseph didn't do that. That's not what shaped his life, but God. Joseph is imprisoned. The false accusation was believed. Okay, so there's a false accusation. Joseph is wronged in that. That the false accusation was believed. Joseph is wronged again. But you don't hear Joseph saying, what's the use? Everybody's against me. Nobody likes me. And Joseph is cast into prison. And we read in Genesis 39:20, and he was there in prison. He was there in prison. There he is, in a cold, dark dungeon, not because of any wrongdoing on his behalf, but because of a false accusation. And I believe as you look at Joseph in that prison, he's not complaining. He's not bitter. He's not tallying up scores. He's been mistreated on several occasions now. He's been wronged. He's not focused upon the wrongs and the slights that he has experienced. He's not absorbed in self-pity, but he's focused upon living his life for God and being the best prisoner I can be. This isn't where I want to be. I'd rather be home. with Dad. This is where I am. And I'll just be the best prisoner I can be. That seems to be Joseph's attitude. So he would do the work of God in that prison. Then Joseph is forgotten. While in prison, Pharaoh's chief of the butlers and chief of the bakers, they're imprisoned also. And in chapter 40, verse 3, the place where Joseph was bound. In verse 4, they're put in Joseph's charge. Again, in time, both of them have a dream that greatly troubled them. Joseph interprets their dreams, telling the butler that in 3 days he'd be restored to his position, telling the baker, chief of the bakers, that he would be hanged. And then he told the chief butler that when he was released, that he would mention him to Pharaoh. And that chief butler forgot all about Joseph. Things are going well for him now. He forgot all about Joseph. Joseph meant everything to him when things weren't going well, but now things are going well. Joseph's out of mind. For 2 years. Now, we realize God's hand is in all of this, God's timing. But humanly speaking, Joseph is wronged again. It's just one after another. Joseph is wronged again. So there's Joseph from a terribly dysfunctional family. He's hated, he's resented by his brothers. His brothers no doubt mocked him, ridiculed him, slandered him. He is betrayed. He is rejected. He is conspired against by his brothers, mistreated, and done injustice by his brothers. Sold as a piece of property by his brothers. Oh, what injustice that Joseph has experienced. And all of this would result in Joseph being sold into slavery and being lied against and falsely accused, which would lead him to being imprisoned. Again, the repeated injustice that was done to Joseph. It seems like everywhere he turns, somebody mistreats Joseph. There's injustice toward him. But in the biblical record, you do not see Joseph focusing upon the wrongs that were done to him. You don't see it. Here we are today. If someone doesn't recognize somebody when they walk in the church door, they're offended. I'm not going back there. Those people are unfriendly. You need to get over yourself and be like Joseph. One injustice after another. You know what Joseph would have done? Had he walked in that door and you didn't say hi to him, he'd have come back next week. And you didn't say hi to him again, guess what? He'd be back again. It wouldn't have bothered him. Because that's not what he's focused on. He's not tallying up scores. He's not focused on ye have done me evil. Ye thought evil against me. Joseph, all this resulted in Joseph being sold into slavery. And again, lied against and falsely accused. He ends up in prison. But again, you don't see Joseph focusing upon the wrong. You do not see him stuck in anger, Did Joseph have a right to be angry? Oh, yes, he did. Wouldn't help them. You might have a right to be angry. That's not going to help you, though. You might have a right to be angry, but it's not going to help you to stay there. It's not going to do you any spiritual good. So he didn't get stuck in anger. He didn't get stuck in hurt. And he didn't get stuck in self-pity. Joseph personally experienced and felt the pain and the turmoil of hatred and resentment and betrayal and conspiracy and rejection and exile and poverty and slavery and slander and temptation, imprisonment, ingratitude, disappointment. He would experience riches, power, and influence, and he rose above it all. He rose above everything and served God with his life. Whatever came his way, whatever bump was in the road, whatever turn was in the road, he is focused upon living his life for God and staying true. Through it all, he maintained a deep personal faith and commitment to God. How was he able to do that? The Lord was with Joseph. By God's grace. That's the only way. He was not diverted by circumstances. He was not diverted by people. He was not going to let people rob him of his life of serving God. He was not going to allow circumstances to rob him of his life. And all the pages of history are cluttered with individuals who allowed a circumstance or a set of circumstances to rob them of their life. A set of injustice to rob them of their life. There's also been those who rose above it. Rose above it. You're not helping someone. You sit down with them, they've come from a dysfunctional family, they've had all these terrible things happen to them, and you say, well, you got it right, I'd be mad too. You're not helping them. Point them to Joseph. Point them to Joseph. It doesn't undo what Joseph's brothers did, but it gives Joseph a remarkable life. And it broke that dysfunction. Joseph didn't continue in the family dysfunction. I believe that there are generational curses in families. Several come to my mind right now. Somebody has to realize, I don't have to follow this. Lord, break the curse with me. You rarely see it happen. It just continues on. So-and-so's like his dad, and like his grandpa, and on it goes. Through it all, Joseph remained committed to God. It would have been easy for Joseph to be overcome with anger. That would have been the easy thing to do. Not the best thing. It would have been easy for him to be overcome with bitterness. And it would have been normal for him to be given over to self-pity. You don't tell someone when they're drowning in self-pity, well, that's normal. Well, rise above the norm. Yeah, it's normal. But normal's pretty bad. You need to rise above the norm. It would have been normal for Joseph to formulate revenge against his brothers. And eventually he's in a position where he could do that. And he could formulate revenge against Potiphar's wife as well, and Potiphar. But he didn't, because that's not how his mind worked. He saw God. And instead, Joseph, instead of formulating revenge in his heart, he forgave his brothers. To me, outside of God's forgiveness, it's one of the best examples of forgiveness in all the Word of God. Joseph forgave his brothers. And yet today, I'll never go back there, brother so-and-so, he didn't say hi to me. Joseph forgave his brothers who truly mistreated him, who truly did him wrong. And now we hear him say, "You thought evil against me." Most cannot get past that. "You thought evil against me." But God. Joseph was able to see and recognize God in it all. And therefore he rose above. He was able to forgive the great evil that his brothers had done to him. He was able to look past it. Well, I sure hope you never expect me to get over this. I can't look past this. Oh, yes, you can. Yes, you can. With God's help. Just be honest. You don't want to. But we can get past it. We can get past anything with God's help. And he let go of what his brothers had done. And his focus here in Genesis 50 is upon God. And what is the result? Joseph had peace in his soul. Yeah, you might have a right to be angry. You might have a right to feel bitter. It won't give you peace in your soul. Whether it's right or not, it's not going to give you peace in your soul. It's going to rob you of that. Joseph got past it. He had peace in his soul. And he lived a spiritually productive, unwasted, profitable life for the glory of God. That is the life that we all ought to desire. Spiritually productive life. You know how many have wasted their lives and they blame it on family? You can blame it on anything. That's not the reason you wasted your life. It's the reason you sold yourself, but it's not the reason. The reason is the reason they had a wasted life is because they never got past, they never rose above the injustice. You can't get through this life. If you live long enough, you can't get through this life without there being some injustice, without there being some mistreatment. But we need to be a people that rise above that. And it all depends on what we choose to focus upon. The evil or God, who's directing it all. What an example that Joseph serves to each of us. God help us to be like Joseph. Brother Dave, if you'll come.